Hi, very glad to see you on the channel. Before you start listening to the story, write in the comments whether you like the voice on the video. It was the kind of early spring morning where the Colorado mountain air still bit at your skin, but the sun promised that winter was finally on its last legs. I rolled into the driveway after a week-long out-of-town site inspection, the truck's tires crunching against the gravel like a familiar welcome. Hannah's car was parked right where it always was, but the house felt different as I stepped inside. There wasn't the usual scent of coffee or that faint trace of her lavender candles burning. The place smelled like it hadn't been lived in for a week, even though she was supposed to have been here every night. I dropped my bag by the door and called out, "Hannah." No answer. The house wasn't a mess, but it wasn't like her either. Shoes scattered, a half-folded blanket draped over the couch, a few dishes left on the kitchen counter like someone had been in a hurry. I made my way to the living room where the fireplace sat cold, and on the coffee table were two mugs, hers and another one that definitely wasn't mine. I picked it up. It wasn't from our usual set. A souvenir mug from a diner I'd never seen before. My gut tightened, but I shook it off. Maybe she'd had a neighbor or Vanessa, her friend from town, over while I was away. A few minutes later, I found her in the back garden, hunched over the flower beds, pruning like nothing was wrong. She turned and smiled, wide and warm, like she hadn't noticed the tension simmering in the air. "Hey, you're back early," she chirped, wiping dirt from her hands. "Managed to wrap up ahead of schedule," I replied, stepping off the porch. "Everything all right around here?" "Of course." She kissed me quickly, almost absent-mindedly, then brushed past me. "You must be starved. Let me make something." As we moved through the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that the rhythm between us was off. She talked about the retreat coming up, how excited everyone was, how much work it had been helping organize it. I knew about the retreat. Frank had mentioned it before I left. It was always a casual thing, a few bonfires, fishing, team-building nonsense. But the way Hannah talked about it now sounded like she was running the whole operation. She never used to care about the company's social events. "Frank's been swamped, so I offered to help," she said, stirring a pot on the stove. "You know how bad he is with logistics." I forced a chuckle. "Yeah, Frank isn't exactly Mr. Organization." Hannah laughed along, but it felt forced. Later that evening, after she went to bed, I found myself sitting on the edge of the couch, staring at that extra coffee mug again. It wasn't Vanessa's style, and I couldn't remember the last time anyone else from work had been over to the house. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired from the trip. But when I glanced at Hannah's phone, left charging on the counter, I noticed it was flipped screen down. That wasn't like her. She never hid text from me, never guarded her phone like it held state secrets. I went to bed without saying a word, pretending I hadn't noticed. I watched her sleep, peaceful and soft, but all I could feel was the nagging weight sitting behind my ribs. Something wasn't adding up. The next few days were no better. She kept mentioning the retreat, like it was the only thing happening in the world. She didn't bring up Frank much, but every time his name did slip in a conversation, it sounded too casual, like she was trying to make it blend in. Worse, she started acting like I was the one who had changed, asking if I was stressed, asking if work was too much, like she was laying the groundwork for me to blame myself if I noticed anything. One night, while I was helping her with dinner, I noticed a pair of new hiking boots by the back door. Men's boots, bigger than mine, coated with fresh mud from the trails. I stared at them for a second too long. "Oh," she said quickly, following my gaze. "Frank left those here after he checked out some of the trails for the retreat. He's thinking about a team-building hike." I raised an eyebrow. Frank came by. She nodded a little too fast. Just briefly. I didn't press, but every alarm in me went off. Frank wasn't the hiking type. He could barely handle stairs without wheezing, let alone mountain trails. That night, while Hannah slept soundly beside me, I sat up in the dark, staring at those boots through the crack in the bedroom door. Something was happening, and I wasn't going to be the fool in this story. The next morning came with a sharp bite of mountain air and a clear sky, the kind that usually settled my nerves. Not today. I watched Hannah flutter around the kitchen, humming to herself as if everything was perfectly ordinary, as if I hadn't spent half the night staring at Frank's muddy boots sitting by the door like some silent confession. I played along. I smiled when I was supposed to, kissed her cheek as I grabbed my coffee, but inside I was crawling. She was talking about the retreat again, listing the menu for the bonfire night, like it was the town's biggest event of the year. I barely heard her. My eyes kept drifting to the boots. They weren't there the day I got home. They had appeared sometime after I went to bed. That much I was sure of. I decided not to mention it. Not yet. While Hannah was busy fussing with decorations, I went out to the garage to find an old tackle box she wanted cleaned out for the retreat. I figured busy work might keep me from overthinking. That's when I found it. A small, carefully wrapped package tucked inside one of the storage bins beneath a pile of extension cords. At first, I thought it might have been something she stashed away for me, maybe an anniversary gift early. But when I unwrapped it, my heart dropped. Inside was a leather-bound flask, engraved with the initials FS. Frank's initials. Alongside, it was a folded note in Hannah's handwriting, for the retreat. For us. I stared at it, feeling the world tilt sideways for a moment. There was no misunderstanding this. No innocent explanation. I could hear her inside, humming like nothing was wrong, and here I stood holding physical proof that something was very, very wrong. I didn't storm in. I didn't yell. Instead, I took the flask, carefully removed the cap, and poured out half of the contents. Then I added just enough water to dilute whatever fancy bourbon she had poured into it. Petty? Maybe. But I wasn't about to let Frank enjoy the gift like nothing was happening. I repackaged it exactly how I found it, and placed it right back where it was hidden. At dinner, Hannah was radiant, talking about how much fun the team would have, how Frank had so many great ideas for bonding. I almost choked on my beer. "You seem invested," I said calmly. She smiled sweetly. "I just want everyone to have a great time." "Of course." I raised my glass and toasted to nothing. Over the next few days, I watched her more carefully. Subtle things jumped out. She kept checking her phone, glancing toward the window whenever someone pulled into the driveway. She even left the house earlier than usual under the excuse of gathering supplies, but returned empty-handed more than once. Still, I said nothing. Instead, I made sure to be present. I helped her prep, cleaned out the garage, organized the fishing gear. Every time she looked at me, I could see it, her searching for guilt on my face, hoping I hadn't noticed the flask, the boots, or the lie she was trying to sell me. One night, while watching a movie, her phone buzzed, and she instinctively snatched it up, reading it under the glow of the screen. I asked without turning away from the TV, "Vanessa?" She jumped. Yeah, just finalizing the head count for the retreat. Vanessa wasn't even coming. She hated these company getaways. I knew then that Hannah wasn't just lying. She was actively covering, carefully stitching together a narrative where I'd be too distracted to notice the fraying seams. But I wasn't distracted. I was watching, and I wasn't going to blink. The closer the retreat got, the more Hannah acted like a woman who had nothing to hide. She laughed more than usual, leaned into me when we watched TV, and even invited me to sit with her while she finalized lists for the bonfire night. To anyone else, it would look like we were just another mountain town couple prepping for a weekend with friends and coworkers. But every word, every gesture felt like it was designed to throw me off. And for a while, almost worked. Then came Kyle. Kyle was one of the younger project managers at the company, barely out of college, eager to please and always hanging around Frank like a stray dog hoping for scraps. One afternoon, while grabbing lunch with a few guys from work, I overheard Kyle mention that he and Hannah had been working together on retreat logistics lately. The way he said it, grinning like an idiot, rubbed me the wrong way. Later that evening, I asked Hannah about it. Kyle said you've been spending time with him for retreat stuff? I tried to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me. Her eyes widened just slightly, then softened into a smile. "Oh, he's harmless. He's been helping with some of the organizing. Frank asked me to loop him in since he's trying to step up." The explanation seemed plausible. Kyle was young, inexperienced, and probably thrilled to have any extra responsibility thrown his way. Still, something about the way Hannah's shoulders tensed, even while smiling, made me second-guess it. I started watching Kyle more closely over the next week. At the pre-retreat meetings, he hovered around Hannah like a puppy. He'd offer to help carry supplies, laughed too hard at her jokes, and tried far too hard to be useful. I couldn't deny there was something off about it. One night, After a late supply run, Hannah came home flustered. I asked where she'd been. "With Kyle," she said, pulling off her coat. We went over the catering checklist. "He's hopeless at it." I raised an eyebrow. "Late for a checklist." "There were issues with the vendor," she said quickly. "Don't worry, I handled it." For a moment, I believed her. She looked tired, sincere, even annoyed, like she really had just dealt with a kid fumbling his way through planning. Maybe I was letting suspicion cloud me. Maybe I wanted there to be something more, because it would somehow make sense of the unease I'd felt since I got home. But then came the slip. I was reorganizing boxes for the retreat when I found another note, scribbled hastily on the corner of a supply list. Hannah's handwriting again. "Remind F about the Friday cabin." F, not K. My stomach sank. I almost confronted her right then, but I stopped. I replayed every conversation in my head. The boots, the flask, the too convenient Kyle story. Frank. It had always been Frank. Kyle was a smokescreen. I went through the motions that evening, sitting through dinner while Hannah rambled about how proud she was of Kyle stepping up. I even nodded and pretended to agree. But inside, I knew Kyle was the wrong target, and Hannah knew exactly what she was doing. That night, when she kissed me goodnight, I felt like I was kissing a stranger. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every subtle sign, every deflection, every extra shift she claimed she was working. The real betrayal wasn't coming from a clueless kid desperate for a promotion. It was coming from the man who signed my paychecks. And Hannah wasn't just hiding it. She was orchestrating it. The day before the retreat, I could barely hold back the storm brewing inside me. Yet I acted like nothing was wrong. I helped Hannah load the car, double-checked the checklist she had taped to the fridge, and even joked about how Frank better appreciate all the extra hours she put into making the weekend perfect. She smiled, brushing flour off her apron, and teased, "Frank would be lost without me." I laughed along, but the words clung to me like burrs. That night, I went back out to the garage after Hannah had fallen asleep, double-checking the bins and supplies we'd packed. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but I found it anyway. A second note, crumpled and shoved into the corner of a box marked extra linens. I recognized the stationery instantly, the monogram Hannah used for personal notes. Friday, 10 p.m. Supply cabin. No name, just that. I sat there for a while, turning the paper over in my hands. There was no Kyle, no other staff involved in planning late-night supply runs. The supply cabin was strictly used for overflow, tools, spare tents, emergency kits. No one went there after dark, not unless they wanted to be alone. The next morning, I woke early, pretending to be excited about the weekend. Hannah was already bustling around the kitchen, her mood light, her smile rehearsed. We drove up to the lodge together, passing winding roads and scenic overlooks, all while she chatted endlessly about how smooth everything would go. Frank greeted us warmly when we arrived, patting me on the back like an old friend. His wife, Laura, was noticeably absent, which wasn't unusual. Laura often avoided these retreats, claiming she didn't care for corporate camping. Hannah and Frank barely interacted at first, staying on opposite sides of the welcome bonfire. But I wasn't watching the group anymore. I was watching them. The subtle glances when they thought no one was looking, the too casual touches when passing supplies, the occasional drift into quiet conversations just out of earshot. After dinner, while everyone was laughing and swapping stories around the fire, I wandered past the tents toward the woods, circling quietly until I found the supply cabin. Locked. Empty. Nothing unusual. But I knew better. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and most were too drunk or too tired to notice anything beyond their own tents, I saw them slip away. Frank first, quietly grabbing a lantern and disappearing down the trail. Hannah followed 10 minutes later, excusing herself with a comment about needing to double-check something for breakfast. I didn't follow. Not yet. Instead, I returned to the fire, keeping my cool as coworkers laughed and passed around another bottle of whiskey. I smiled. I nodded. I waited, because I knew exactly where they were. And soon, I'd know exactly what they were doing. Laura arrived the next morning, surprising everyone. She hugged a few of the employees, waved off questions about skipping the first night, and settled in like she hadn't just arrived to walk directly into a landmine. She found me by the lake as I was pretending to check fishing lines. "Mike," she said softly, "is everything okay?" I shrugged. Why wouldn't it be? She gave me a look like she could see through me. Laura always had a quiet way about her, but she wasn't stupid. She watched people. "Listened. You look like you know something," she said. I chuckled without humor. "Maybe I do." She didn't press. She just stood next to me, looking out over the lake. I realized then that Laura had probably lived with that same gut feeling I'd been battling for weeks. I saw in the way she clenched her jaw every time Frank's name came up around the campfire. She wasn't just suspicious, she knew. By nightfall, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Everyone gathered for the second bonfire, laughter louder, drinks stronger, but beneath it all, I could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on me. And while Hannah smiled and played the part of the glowing retreat coordinator, I wasn't looking at her anymore. I was looking at Frank, and I was already picturing exactly how I was going to end this. I knew exactly what I was walking into that night, but still, there was a part of me that hoped maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe I was reading too much into the notes, the glances, the quiet laughter tucked behind trees when they thought no one was watching. But the moment I saw Hannah slip away from the campfire after flashing me a soft, practiced smile, I knew. I waited, sipping bourbon by the dying flames, letting the minutes stretch long and heavy until Frank disappeared into the woods too, following the same path as the night before. No one noticed him go. The younger guys were too deep into a drinking game, and the older staff were too busy arguing about who was going to win the fishing derby. Even Laura was occupied, half listening to a tipsy intern complain about tent poles. I stood up quietly, walked to the edge of the clearing, and slipped into the woods, my boots silent on the soft earth. I kept to the trees, weaving along the familiar trail until I saw the faint glow of a lantern through the cracks of the supply cabin's wooden slats. Their voices floated through the quiet night, soft but clear. Hannah's laugh, one I knew too well. Frank's low rumble of a response. I crept closer, careful not to snap a twig, until I was just near enough to see through a gap where two planks had warped away from each other. There they were. Hannah leaned against one of the workbenches, her body language too relaxed, too comfortable. Frank stood close, closer than any boss should be, and I didn't need to hear every word to understand the tone. She wasn't organizing breakfast supplies. She wasn't sorting fishing gear. She was there for him. Frank reached into the box and pulled out the leather-bound flask, the one I'd found hidden in our garage. He grinned and said something that made Hannah giggle. When he unscrewed the cap and took a sip, I almost smiled to myself, remembering how I'd watered it down. They both laughed like old lovers. Like this was normal. Like I wasn't less than 50 feet away. I could have ended it right there. I could have stormed in and demanded answers. But I didn't. Instead, I watched. I let the scene burn itself into me. Every smirk, every quiet touch. I needed to see it. I needed to know I wasn't crazy, that the sleepless nights, the tightness in my chest, the gnawing doubt, it was all real. Eventually, Frank leaned in closer, whispered something, and they left together, walking back toward camp along the far path behind the ridge, avoiding the main trail like they had rehearsed it. I stayed by the cabin a while longer, letting the cold seep into me, hardening me. The anger wasn't explosive. It was steady, measured. I knew then that I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to give either of them the satisfaction. I was going to take it all away. By the time I returned to camp, the fire had died down. Hannah was back, sitting on a log, talking with Laura and a few of the crew, like she hadn't just been sneaking off with Frank under the cover of night. When our eyes met, she smiled. "You okay?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Just needed some air." She bought it. She thought I was still in the dark. Later that night, while everyone drifted off to their tents, I found myself standing by the lake, staring out at the reflection of the moon on the still water. I didn't know how long Laura had been standing beside me before she spoke. "You know, don't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "Yeah." She exhaled. "Me too." I glanced at her, but she was staring at the water, not at me. No tears, no rage. Just a quiet understanding of someone who had seen the same show play out more than once. "They're stupid," I said. "They're predictable," she corrected. We stood there in silence, two people who had been handed the same bitter truth from different angles. And just like that, without a word spoken between us, I realized I wasn't alone. But Hannah? Hannah was about to be. The next morning broke crisp and cold, but you wouldn't know it by looking at Hannah. She buzzed around the campsite like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't snuck off into the woods the night before with Frank. She laughed with coworkers, offered to help set up breakfast, and even stole glances at me, soft and innocent like we were still the couple we used to be. I matched her step for step. I smiled. I thanked her for the coffee. I even kissed her on the cheek when a few coworkers were watching. If she noticed how calculated it felt, she didn't show it. I spent most of the morning watching, not speaking. Frank was quieter than usual, avoiding Laura entirely. I could see him watching Hannah too, carefully, like they were both carrying a fragile secret, and neither dared make the first crack. They thought they were being clever. They thought they were pulling off the performance of their lives. They didn't know I'd already read the script. As the team packed up for the afternoon fishing trip, I stayed behind, claiming I needed to prep gear. Truth was, I needed to think. I walked out to the old supply cabin, standing by the door they had left slightly ajar the night before. Inside, the faintest smell of Frank's cologne still lingered. On the bench, the flask still sat half empty. For a moment, I just stood there, absorbing it all. I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't shaken. I was steady, sharper than I'd felt in weeks. As I returned to camp, I caught Laura sitting alone by the edge of the clearing, her eyes distant as she twirled a twig between her fingers. I sat next to her without saying a word. "Did you follow them?" she asked softly. I nodded. She gave a bitter laugh. "I knew it. You knew last night?" "I've known for months," she said. "But hearing it is different." We sat in silence, both staring out at the woods like we were waiting for something to emerge. I realized we weren't just betrayed. We'd been made spectators in our own lives, watching two people we trusted make fools of us. That evening, while everyone gathered for the traditional pre-derby dinner, I decided it was time. But I didn't want a scene. I didn't want shouting, chairs flipping, or dramatic accusations. I wanted something cleaner, something undeniable. When Frank pulled me aside before dinner to talk about the presentation for the next morning, our usual slideshow of photos and highlights, I volunteered to handle it. He looked relieved. I'd always been the quiet, reliable one, and I could see him clinging to that version of me like it would save him. Hannah watched from across the campfire, eyes flicking between me and Frank like she could sense a shift, but couldn't put her finger on it. Good. Let her wonder. The night ended like it always did, with people stumbling to their tents, the fire dying low, and the wind carrying the scent of pine and smoke through the camp. Hannah crawled into our tent beside me and whispered, "You okay? You've been quiet." I stared at the canvas ceiling. "I'm fine." She snuggled closer. "Tomorrow's going to be great." I let her believe it, because tomorrow wouldn't just be great. It would be unforgettable. The next morning dawned warmer than expected, but inside me, everything felt ice cold. I helped set up the breakfast tables, carry gear, and even tease the younger guys about who was going to capsize first during the derby. I kept it all together. The calm husband, the dependable co-worker, the quiet company man. No one could tell the difference. No one except Laura, who kept sneaking glances at me across the clearing. Reading the storm, I kept carefully contained behind small talk and smiles. Frank strutted around camp like usual, telling fishing stories to anyone who'd listen, while Hannah moved smoothly between the groups, checking on supplies, complimenting people's setups, pretending to be the perfect hostess. They thought they had pulled it off. They thought they were in the clear. And I was happy to let them believe it for a few more hours. After breakfast, everyone gathered around the main tent for the annual slideshow presentation, an informal tradition where we'd show off photos from past retreats and go over safety reminders. I had spent the early hours of the morning finalizing the file on my laptop, and now I stood beside Frank as he welcomed everyone, grinning like a proud leader. "I'll let Mike take it from here," Frank said, clapping me on the back. I stepped up without hesitation. "Thanks, Frank. This won't take long, I promise." I plugged in a laptop, and the projector flickered to life against the makeshift canvas screen. Photos of last year's derby rolled by. Smiling faces, fish being held up like trophies, campfires glowing under the stars. Laughter filled the tent, just like it always did. Then came the final slide. Not the safety reminders, not the list of sponsors, but a video. At first, people thought it was just another prank clip. They chuckled at the shaky footage of two co-workers sneaking toward the supply cabin. Then silence fell. The video sharpened. The drunken, unintentional cameraman had caught it perfectly. Hannah and Frank slipping inside the cabin hand in hand, unaware they were being recorded. A collective gasp rose from the group. Heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire. I didn't flinch. Frank stammered. "Mike, what the hell?" I raised a hand to silence him. "And one more," I said calmly, clicking to the next clip. This one wasn't accidental. It was mine, taken just the night before. Laura and I sitting in Frank's own truck, sharing a bottle of bourbon, laughing, leaning in, and without shame, kissing. The sound of our laughter echoed in the stunned silence. The room went dead. Frank turned ghost white. Hannah's knees buckled as she gripped the edge of the table for balance. I let the moment breathe. "I took some team-building advice, too," I said, my voice steady and cutting through the quiet like a blade. The shock settled into the air like fog. No one said a word. Not Laura. Not Frank. Not even Hannah. Slowly, I unplugged the laptop, closed it, and walked straight out of the tent without looking back. Behind me, chaos unraveled. Raised voices, accusations, people scrambling to figure out if what they saw was real. I walked down to the lake, took a deep breath, and felt something I hadn't in weeks. Peace. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to fight. I just needed them to see it. And they did. The silence after the slideshow fallout wasn't just awkward. It was radioactive. No one spoke to Hannah the rest of the day. She wandered around camp like a ghost, trying to insert herself into conversations only to be met with short replies or turnbacks. Even Frank avoided her, retreating into his tent for most of the afternoon like a coward hoping the storm would pass without ruining him completely. I watched it all from a distance, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to salvage. That evening, after most of the crew packed up early and left camp quieter than I'd ever seen it, Hannah found me down by the water. The sunset reflected off the lake like a mirror, casting long orange streaks across the surface. She approached cautiously, like I was a wild animal she wasn't sure would snap or bolt. "Mike, please," she whispered, voice cracking. "We need to talk." I didn't look at her. She took a step closer. I messed up. I know I did. But we can fix this. I swear to you we can." I turned slowly, meeting her tear-soaked eyes. "Fix what? The marriage you gutted, or the trust you buried in that cabin?" Her lip trembled. I only wanted to feel needed again. I didn't plan for it to go that far. It wasn't supposed to. To what? I interrupted, voice sharp but steady. It wasn't supposed to destroy everything. It wasn't supposed to humiliate me in front of the entire company. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped closer, gripping my jacket. "I love you, Mike." I panicked. I felt like you didn't see me anymore. "I saw you just fine," I said. "You were the one looking past me." She sobbed harder. Please don't leave me like this." "You left first," I replied coldly. "The second you stepped into that cabin with him, you left." She collapsed onto the dirt, wailing into her hands. I stood over her, feeling nothing. No anger, no pity, just the finality of it all. The woman crying in front of me wasn't the one I married. That version of her had vanished a long time ago. I just hadn't seen it until now. "I'll quit," she begged through tears. "I'll never speak to Frank again. I'll tell everyone it was all me. I'll do anything, Mike. I'll change." I laughed, empty and hollow. "You already changed. The second you made the choice to betray me." She crawled forward on her knees, grabbing at my hand. "You don't mean this. You don't mean it's over." I pulled my hand away like it burned. "No, Hannah, I've never been more certain about anything in my life." Her sobs filled the space between us, echoing off the lake and into the woods. I turned and walked back toward camp, leaving her there to crumble. I didn't glance back, not even once. When I returned, Laura was standing by the fire pit, arms crossed. Without a word, she nodded toward the trail behind me. "She tried to fix it?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah." Laura gave a sharp exhale. Typical. Neither of us said another word. We didn't have to. I packed up my things before sunrise, loaded the truck quietly, and watched as the first rays of daylight crept over the ridge. Hannah never came back to camp. Whether she stayed by the water all night or vanished somewhere into the woods, I didn't care. I drove away from that retreat with a weight gone from my chest. Not lighter, not yet, but finally empty. And sometimes, empty is better than carrying the weight of someone else's lies. The silence after the slideshow fallout wasn't just awkward, it was radioactive. No one spoke to Hannah the rest of the day. She wandered around camp like a ghost, tried to insert herself into conversations only to be met with short replies or turnbacks. Even Frank avoided her, retreating into his tent for most of the afternoon like a coward hoping the storm would pass without ruining him completely. I watched it all from distance, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to salvage. That evening, after most of the crew packed up early and left camp quieter than I'd ever seen it, Hannah found me down by the water. The sunset reflected off the lake like a mirror, casting long orange streaks across the surface. She approached cautiously, like I was a wild animal she wasn't sure would snap or bolt. "Mike, please," she whispered, voice cracking. "We need to talk." I didn't look at her. She took a step closer. I messed up. I know I did. But we can fix this. I swear to you we can." I turned slowly, meeting her tear-soaked eyes. "Fix what? The marriage you gutted, or the trust you buried in that cabin?" Her lip trembled. I only wanted to feel needed again. I didn't plan for it to go that far. It wasn't supposed to what? I interrupted, voice sharp but steady. It wasn't supposed to destroy everything. It wasn't supposed to humiliate me in front of the entire company. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped closer, gripping my jacket. "I love you, Mike." I panicked. I felt like you didn't see me anymore. "I saw you just fine," I said. "You were the one looking past me." She sobbed harder. Please don't leave me like this." "You left first," I replied coldly. "The second you stepped into that cabin with him, you left." She collapsed onto the dirt, wailing into her hands. I stood over her, feeling nothing. No anger, no pity, just the finality of it all. The woman crying in front of me wasn't the one I married. That version of her had vanished a long time ago. I just hadn't seen it until now. "I'll quit," she begged through tears. "I'll never speak to Frank again. I'll tell everyone it was all me. I'll do anything, Mike. I'll change." I laughed, empty and hollow. "You already changed. The second you made the choice to betray me." She crawled forward on her knees, grabbing at my hand. "You don't mean this. You don't mean it's over." I pulled my hand away like it burned. "No, Hannah, I've never been more certain about anything in my life." Her sobs filled the space between us, echoing off the lake and into the woods. I turned and walked back toward camp, leaving her there to crumble. I didn't glance back, not even once. When I returned, Laura was standing by the fire pit, arms crossed. Without a word, she nodded toward the trail behind me. "She tried to fix it?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah." Laura gave a sharp exhale. Typical. Neither of us said another word. We didn't have to. I packed up my things before sunrise, loaded the truck quietly, and watched as the first rays of daylight crept over the ridge. Hannah never came back to camp. Whether she stayed by the water all night or vanished somewhere into the woods, I didn't care. I drove away from that retreat with the weight gone from my chest. Not lighter, not yet, but finally empty. And sometimes, empty is better than carrying the weight of someone else's lies. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Don't forget to give a like and tell us in the comments what you would do in such a situation.